What the hell is the devil? Well, let's look up the origin of the word now. I'm going to give you a warning right now. Eventually, there's going to be some controversial content in this here recording. Okay? So be prepared to be really intrigued and provoked and challenged. If you're not up for that, that's cool. Move on. All right. What the hell is the devil? Before 900, according to some internet reference dictionary thing, the word devil goes back ultimately toward the Greek term dia-bolos, as in diabolical, in Spanish, diablo. It's a reference to assaulting someone's character, slander, accuse, to vilify, to shame, to relate to from a spirit of contempt. Of the various categories of human action, one can label some bad or evil, or any one of many labels that may be more or less extreme in their connotations. Like dangerous isn't as harsh a word as evil, or unfavorable is even less harsh of a word. So we can go around and throw these kind of labels on any human action. Okay, and sort out 20 different human actions and sort out across the spectrum which ones are better or worse, holy or unholy, whatever. So you may even think that the acts or actions themselves are inherently evil or good or diabolical or bad or pure or heroic or whatever, which is exactly what you've been trained to do, to automatically, reactively, reflexively label actions as inherently belonging on some part of a moral spectrum, like immoral, moral, or evil, good, whatever. However, occasionally people may disagree or even change their perception as to whether a particular event or action was heroic or evil or what. The thing that I justified at one point, I may later go, oh, wow, that was actually, I was not fully informed, or I had a misperception or a misunderstanding or whatever. So I might later apologize for something that at one time I was very, stubborn about defending and, driving it down other people's minds that they should agree with me, that kind of righteousness. So I know what the root of the word devil is, as in diabolos, as I mentioned before. I know what the root of that means. The word devil, diabolos, the slandering, the spirit of contempt, all that stuff. It is a reference to labeling something bad, as if that thing is inherently bad, rather than recognizing the labeling as one valid way of relating to something. Like a relationship, a relational thing, a relative thing, like relativity. So it is a very simple linguistic issue, an elementary, fundamental, self-evident, but perhaps only rarely recognized issue. Labeling something, I can label cigarette smoking good, bad, profitable, harmful, immoral, sinful, shameful, patriotic, whatever. You pick a label, I can put it on any action. Any label can be applied to any action. Now, that might not be very useful, right? But I can call cigarette smoking evil. I can do that. And you might not agree, or a lot of people might say, no, that's obviously, it's part of a religious ritual that you should smoke cigarettes if you are a true, believer in the true religion of whatever, and cigarette smoking is part of the ritual, and it's just, that's what you should do. If that's your position, fine. I'm not, whatever. So, the actions and the labels in terms of these adjectives that we might apply to uh, put some action in a particular part of a spectrum of morality, those are two completely independent things. The action or process or event, and then the labeling of it. All right? So when politicians demonize other politicians as the enemy, that may be intentional propaganda, or it may be sincere rage. Usually politicians aren't that sincere in their rage, or they wouldn't be politicians. But obviously lots of politicians do intentionally denounce or defame other politicians, whether it's the other person in the primary election that they're running against, or a politician in a faraway place, or whatever. The U.S. Official is condemning the Alabama state official, or the Alabama state official is condemning the national official, whatever. So in the case of the U.S., the vilification of the alleged threat posed by the Native Americans has been followed by lots of other vilifications. Vilification of the British in the time of the Revolutionary War. Of course, the vilification of the Confederates. The vilification of the French, of the Spanish during and prior to the Spanish-American War, the Cubans, the Japanese, the Germans, the Soviets, and various other former allies throughout the world that at some time were labeled as enemies or demonized by politicians within the U.S. And there's nothing specifically unique about U.S. politicians in that regard, by the way. Basically, as George Orwell pointed out in his book 1984, all of our greatest enemies were our prior allies, and perhaps will be again soon. Be allies again soon. By ours, George Orwell, of course, implied whoever and wherever you are, like throughout the world, whether we're talking about small-scale politics or religions or whatever. Over time, groups will see various other groups as allies or enemies, and it changes over time. In the case of Saddam Hussein, who I showed in the picture above with the South Park Satan, I don't even know who the other guy is. I assume it's Tony Blair or something, but I was a British politician. But I actually, I don't. Maybe it's no. I think I would recognize it was Tony Blair. I don't know who that other guy is. Anyway, in the case of Saddam Hussein, the propagandists of the U.S. presented justifications of preemptive strikes against Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi civilians and military and so on by condemning Saddam's use of chemical weapons against civilian populations in the 1980s. In other words, him, authorizing that use or being the administrative official in charge when the use happened, apparently. Not that he personally went out and used it, every single case. The other mercenaries go out and handle that, called the Iraqi army, probably, or police force, whatever. So, propagandists of the U.S. Condemned his use of chemical weapons about a decade ago, actually a couple decades ago first, right? So now the interesting thing, so let's say that it was 1991 when it was first condemned by the U.S. and say 83 when it was first performed. I don't know if those figures are quite accurate, but what if the U.S. supplied those chemical weapons in 1983 and throughout the 80s, and then all of a sudden in 91 started condemning it? Well, I think that's pretty much what happened. The U.S. supplied those weapons and did not seem to condemn the use of them at the time. It continued to supply them over time. So, nor did the U.S. condemn any of the many uses of chemical weapons by the U.S. against civilians, such as the 3 million Vietnamese civilians allegedly killed by the U.S. military in about 10 years in the 20th century. Many of them killed through the use of Agent Orange and other chemical weapons. So there's a little bit of irony, or a lot of irony. So is it demonized to suddenly condemn something, especially while one is hypocritically doing the same thing? Yes, that would be demonizing. I'm not demonizing. I'm saying that's demonizing. That's an example of demonizing. Now let's look at the root of the word vilify. It's from the 15th century Latin vilificare, which means to make worthless, to make vile, to speak evil of, to speak ill of, to slander, to defame. Sounds a whole lot like the root of the word devil, and it should probably, because vilify and devil, dia-bolos, they seem to have these common roots. Vilifying or demonizing is to cultivate ill will or contempt. That's what they're for. It's the cultivating of ill will or contempt, to demonize or vilify or whatever. We might even call it to curse, as in a type of black magic, again related to the root of the word devil, the slanderer, the accuser, all that stuff. So what does the root of the word vile mean? We're talking about to make something vile or to claim it as vile, to label it vile. Well, the root of the word vile means common. At least that's one of the connotations. So, propaganda may be used to justify certain actions by condemning other actions. We justify the use of chemical weapons by condemning the use of chemical weapons. If the action condemned and the action justified are essentially the same action, that is still propaganda. In many traditional forms of spiritual practice, there are warnings about the spirit of contempt or the spirit of the devil. In some cases, people may even be trained to have contempt for contempt, or to condemn condemnation, or to vilify vilification, to demonize demonizing. However, to be aware or to beware of vilification is actually the core teaching. It's be cognizant of, recognize it, notice this distinction and linguistic process of vilification, of demonizing. In the Christian New Testament, is the teaching to vilify vilification, or to remove the blind rage from one's own perspective or one's own eye before trying to remove the blind rage from someone else's point of view? If I'm blindly raging, I'm not going to be very effective at improving someone else's vision, right? Or comprehension or perceptiveness. So is the teaching of the New Testament to throw stones of blind rage at those who throw stones, or to question the blind rage that might lead to throwing stones, to turn away from that which offends thee? If your eye offends thee, gouge it out, get rid of it. If your hand offends thee, cut it off and get rid of it. If something external to you offends thee, turn away from it. Turn away from evil. That's just one possibility, but that is part of the teaching of the New Testament. One of the teachings of the New Testament. So while it may be popular to condemn the U.S. government for propaganda, or any other government that uses propaganda, Iraqi government during the period that Saddam was there, they use propaganda, they use chemical weapons, whatever. So, well, it's popular to condemn governments, especially within certain subcultures of the U.S. to condemn the U.S. government. Which government in the last several thousand years has not consistently used propaganda? Given that the U.S. has been the dominant imperialist operation on this planet for many decades, the U.S. has certainly used propaganda much more than certain smaller operations, just because the U.S. operation is so much larger. However, propaganda indoctrinating people to reactively and reflexively condemn all propaganda may be the single most universal ingredient of all propaganda campaigns. For thousands of years, consistently, propaganda is evil. That's what we're trained to perceive, to believe, to think. Why is propaganda evil? Well, that is what the propagandists trained us to think, isn't it? There's really what's the rationale? Why is it evil? Well, it's evil. Why? Because it's evil. Why is it evil? Because it is. Okay. Because we'll punish you if you don't agree with us, right? If you want to get along in this society, agree that it's evil. That's why. Oh. So why is vilification vilified? Well, if everyone knew the secret of what vilification is, just throwing a slanderous, accusatory label across something, and how vastly that can affect other people's perceptions. Well, if everybody knew the secret of what vilification is and how easy it is to practice it in language and how effective it can be, then concocted vilifications of propagandists might not work nearly as well to govern the perceptions and actions of the masses. Maybe that's why vilification is vilified. Maybe that's why propaganda is taboo and evil and something that people are hesitant to just directly recognize. It's taboo. We shouldn't even mention it. It's evil. What's evil? Propaganda. What's propaganda? Evil. So propaganda must first be labeled evil for propaganda to be so openly and widely used. Propaganda must be vilified. Vilification must be demonized. Demonizing must be condemned. Labeled evil. That kind of thing. That may be the best way to keep a near monopoly on the power of demonizing and vilifying. That may be essential to the justifying of the operation of governments. If there are no enemies near and far, requiring protectors and even saviors, then why would people want to eagerly pay taxes to the ruling protection racketeers? Fear. Realistically, whenever there is an absence of a bureaucracy protecting the masses from organized violence through the use of organized violence, a new bureaucracy forms to fill that void. Dense populations of humans naturally produce social structures of stratification and organized violence, labels of morality, vilification, so forth. The denser the population, the more stratified the structure is. The more stratified the structure, the more that justification of that stratification through propaganda is relevant. To serve that propaganda function, many dense populations of humans create enemies through accusation, slander, spirit of contempt, and so on. Leaders of dense populations are those who unite dense populations by identifying enemies, threats, even concocted enemies. Even the global enemy of global warming is used to justify new bureaucratic concentrations of authority called globalization or communism or international cooperation. Whatever you call it, it's the same process. The label doesn't change the process. It's a concentration of authority, a further abdication of power away from individual choice towards some hierarchy. Fascist, Christian, whatever label you put on it, whether it's the Holy Roman Empire or the Babylonian Empire, doesn't really matter. It's an empire. So, other global enemies include epidemics or intergalactic threats like pole shifts or asteroids. Of course, one of the most popular global enemies is war, especially nuclear war. All of the organizations that have nuclear weapons seem to be very focused on keeping their club exclusive by discouraging any other organizations from developing nuclear weapons, even nuclear technology for use in electricity generation, which of course means energy independence, which is not good for the oil industry and the hydrocarbon industry, but that's another subject. Or is it? Anyway, why do the organizations with nuclear weapons agree so consistently that nuclear weapons are so dangerous that any group that tries to develop new nuclear weapons should be discouraged? Strongly, forcefully, even if that means by using nuclear weapons against them. Well, perhaps because that kind of propaganda works very well to justify a wide variety of bureaucratic practices and produce compliance from the masses. Perhaps because it works well is why those organizations that already have nuclear weapons threaten to use them against those who don't, basically, especially those who are called evil. Like if North Korea develops chemical weapons, that's evil. If North Korea has a nuclear proliferation program, that's evil. If Alabama does, well, that's part of they're amongst the good guys, so that's not a problem. Why? Because they're amongst the good guys. According to whom? The propagandists. So now you kind of get the whole background here. So propagandists never announce that there is a new war being sold to the masses to perpetuate warfare and perpetuate and cultivate war profiteering and the perpetuating of governments of organized coercion. That's just not what propagandists would say. Propagandists instead announce that there is another new war to end all wars. A few years later, we'll have another new war to end all wars, and so on. Thousands of years pass. The only reason there's ever been any war was to end all wars, according to propagandists. How many thousands of years have propagandists been justifying wars in the name of peace and national security and that kind of thing? Well, I'm not certain. I would guess that propagandists have been rationalizing peacekeeping wars of organized coercion for about as long as propagandists have been vilifying propaganda, demonizing propaganda, monopolizing propaganda. Given that taxation could be considered a war of organized coercion against the domestic population of any country or political system, county, whatever, I would assert that propagandists must have been useful to governments almost as long as mercenaries to justify taxation, as well as to, in the case of mercenaries, to perform the collection activity. In fact, if a competent propagandist hires enough mercenaries to perform operations of organized violence, that might be the origin of all systems of government, all political systems. When an operation of organized violence is so effective that it excludes competing operations of organized violence and forms a functional monopoly, that is called government. I'm not aware of a single operation of government that does not extensively use language for propaganda to justify the existence of that operation of government, that operation of monopolized organized coercion. Mythology about the heroism of the founders of a government is one of the universals of propaganda. They were heroic. Who? The founders of every government everywhere for thousands of years. The founders of political systems are always mythologized as heroes by the propagandists within those political systems. It's universal. With the other universal theme of propaganda being anti-propaganda propaganda.